Hi guys, it's Ria. This is another episode of Bunka, and it's actually going to be the last episode of this season. And although I am hoping that enough topics pop up for a second season, I may just release a couple of extra mini-sodes about other topics that I haven't been able to cover in the last 9 episodes. So for those who are only just joining on this episode, I have been going around New Zealand and talking to people about aspects of Japanese culture that are present in Aotearoa. And today's episode is actually going to be about Yuki Kihara. And Yuki actually represented New Zealand at the Venice Biennale this year. So the Venice Biennale is often called the Olympics of the art world, and it's an exhibition which occurs every year in Venice in Italy, and it alternates each year between art and architecture, and it essentially displays the world's greats as a giant international festival of contemporary art, and it's an honour really to be representing your country on the world stage. So at the Biennale, countries have national pavilions which show one or more artists, and this year New Zealand's representative at the Biennale was Yuki Kihara, and Yuki is a half Japanese, half Samoan contemporary multimedia artist who I've lucky enough been able to talk with recently. But unlike my other episodes where I've been talking with people and having recording conversations, Yuki is actually an incredibly busy person. Obviously being at the Biennale, she has been flying back and forwards from Italy a lot over the last 8 or 9 months as the Biennale runs from May until November. So she answered my questions in writing over email, and I'm just going to incorporate some of those answers into this episode. So the Biennale began in 1895 with over 200,000 visitors coming to Venice to see the current trends in the art world at the time. Although it originally began as showcasing only Italian artists, it has now grown from including just 7 countries in 1914 to now including artworks from 85 different countries this year. Seeing that this podcast has been about the coming together of 2 cultures, I felt this was an appropriate episode to end on, as the Biennale and the work that Yuki is doing in her practice exemplifies embracing cultures and celebrating not only where you come from, but the world and multiculturalism in general. Yuki is the first Pacific, Asian, whawhawhine and transgender artist which Aotearoa has had represent them at the Biennale. So Yuki's mother is Samoan and her father is Japanese. Her father was a volunteer with the Japan International Cooperation Agency, which is a company that works with developing countries, and they strive to help people, prosperity, peace and the planet. And an article in the Samoan Observer in 2019 said that to date 650 volunteers from JICA have served in Samoa. More recently in 2020, JICA actually supervised a Japanese construction company to build a bridge into Apia port, and this was called the Vaisi-Gano Bridge. And the bridge took years to be constructed with skirting around bureaucracies and political hoopla, and it was a process which took 8 years or so. So while he was volunteering in 1973, Yuki's father was in Upolu Island, where he met Yuki's mother. Upolu is the most populated island in Samoa, and it's home to the capital city Apia and Sinamoga village, which at the time was the hub of the Japanese community in Samoa. And this village was made up of small businesses and NGOs. And Sinamoga is a village on the edges of Apia. So Yuki was born then in 1975 in Samoa, and shortly after the family moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, as her father had gotten a job as a civil engineer there. And then they moved to Osaka in around 1980. And while in Japan, Yuki attended kindergarten and primary school. And just like any other Japanese family, they would visit Buddhist temples at New Year's, go to Hanami festivals to see cherry blossoms, watch kabuki, and go on onsen trips in the countryside. However, unlike a regular Japanese family, Yuki knew hers was different. There were not that many families in Japan and around her that were mixed race. Eventually, the family moved back to Upolu, and her parents opened the island's first Japanese restaurant, Lucina's Lounge, in around 1985, which was open for almost 11 years. The restaurant served Japanese and Samoan fusion food, and it was really popular with the locals. And Yuki used to work at the restaurant growing up, and she said that the travelling and moving as a child had exposed her to diverse cultures and people, making her who she is today. Yuki first came to Aotearoa in 1989, studying at St Patrick's College, a boarding school in Upper Hutt, before going to Wellington Polytechnic to study fashion design. One of Yuki's works, Samoa no Uta, or A Song About Samoa, which she's been working on over the past few years, discusses the newly opened and aforementioned Vaisigano Bridge, discussing a concept that Yuki coins as aidscape. And the work discusses the ways in which international or foreign aid has changed the natural, physical and psychological landscape of Samoa. Though the assistance from foreign organisations is beneficial for transport or economy, the other effects are changing the dynamics and power within Samoa. In 2021, the second phase of Samoa no Uta discusses these changes and aidscape, with the work being called Whānau, or land. Samoa no Uta is a 5-year project that was inspired by a Japanese children's song, Samoa to no Uta, which Yuki says was impactful to her. And the work portrays the past and present intersections of Samoa, Japan and Oceania. And the first iteration of Samoa no Uta was titled Vasa, which means open ocean, as the ocean connects Samoa and Japan to one another. Although critiquing the concept of aidscape, Whānau also comments on climate change in general, considering the implications of the consumption foreign countries has caused on island nations like Samoa. Yuki's commentary on the work is that it is a forewarning against Samoa's speculative future that favours economic development and globalisation at the expense of traditional knowledge systems and the local environment, an argument that is often discussed in Aotearoa as well. But Samoa no Uta also represents Yuki herself, alluding to the two halves of who she is. It was in 2015 when Yuki came across an old kimono that belonged to her Japanese grandmother, Masako Kihara. The kimono was similar in shape to a siapo, which is a handmade Samoan bark cloth made from the fibres of the bark from a paper mulberry tree, also known as lau ua. It inspired Yuki to make Samoa no Uta by bringing together the textile traditions of Samoa's tapa or bark cloth and Japan's kimono, and the kimono which hang in Samoa no Uta are made from tapa. Through the work, Yuki is attempting to close the va, or the distance between Japan and the Pacific, particularly Samoa. There's also similarities between kimono and siapo for the way in which they have been culturally misappropriated in the outside world. They're both traditional garments, often used in ceremonies, but the world has often confused authenticity with exoticism. Yuki is probably more known for her work commenting on Pacifica life and specifically aspects of Samoa. However, she did tell me she always wanted to make work in reference to Japan and her Japanese heritage, but that she felt it needed to be in a context outside of purely her own identity, and that she wanted to find a way to present work which also explored social, political, and cultural exchange between Japan and the Pacific. I recently completed an episode on Auckland War Memorial Museum where I discussed the Japanese antiquities there. Now, if you visit the museum and ascend the marble staircases from the grand foyer, you may see an artwork from Yuki Kihara, one of the newer acquisitions to the museum's collection, Motuihe Island. It comes from a series called The Quarantine Islands, made by Yuki in 2021. And in the series, Yuki visited islands near Aotearoa, which were formerly used to quarantine people and animals who had contagious diseases. And Yuki takes photographs in colonial dresses in a documentary-style photograph with holographic surfaces. So you can definitely check that out when you visit the museum. As I said, Yuki represented Aotearoa at the Venice Biennale, but she's also represented by Milford Galleries in Queenstown and Dunedin. And her extensive website displays and discusses a number of her works, which I will link in the description. This year she also exhibited at the Aichi Triennale in Japan, which was titled Still Alive and discusses the pandemic and human existence in terms of perseverance, survival and longevity. Although many works were exhibited in the Aichi Art Centre, some were displayed within traditional buildings and places of significance in the district. Yuki's Samoa no Uta Whanua work was exhibited in the Oka family residence, a building dating back to the Edo period, which once belonged to a tie-dye wholesaler. And Stuart Munro wrote a great description of the work, which I'm going to read to you. The 5 distinct kimono panels are made of tapa, the bark cloth handmade in the islands of the Pacific Ocean from the paper mulberry tree. The work at Aichi follows an earlier work not seen there, Phase 1, Vasa, Ocean, 2019, a cross-section of 5 panels that feature a skull at the bottom of the ocean in memory of the earthquake and tsunami of 2009. Those images of the past connect to the present work, Phase 2, Whanua, Land, 2020 to 2021, a flotsam and jetsam of chaos unfolding through 5 kimono. The first 2 illustrate the aggressive farming of Samoa in more recent years, while the central kimono depicts the new Vai-Sigano Bridge in Samoa's capital, Apia. The bridge, connecting Apia with the new industrial area, was built to replace the existing 67-year-old bridge as part of a new development in the town centre. The road sign on the new structure proudly bears American and Japanese flags, acknowledgements of the international aid that helped pay for it. In Kihara's work, a Samoan bull dominates the scene, blocking access to the bridge, the building of which was not without controversy, viewed by some as merely a cosmetic development. The new bridge, the bull, the construction earth movers and the fruit bats swinging from trees all seem as helpless in the face of international aid relief, renovation and the ongoing effects of colonialism as they are in the face of a tsunami, rapidly approaching the beach and tourist hotel depicted in the next 2 kimono panels. Every environmental disaster Samoa faces, from flooding to tsunamis, dredges up the past to reinforce the constant presence of colonialism. Masami Tsujita, author of The Samoan Aidscape, describes how an influx of foreign aid is also changing the cultural landscape of Samoa. As Kihara argues in an interview, rather than lending help, mass tourism driven by foreign aid has had the opposite effect, triggering climate change and reinforcing cultural stereotypes. On the other end of the room was the kimono which inspired it all, Yuki's grandmother's. Although Yuki had never met Masako nor her grandfather Nobuo, the presentation of the kimono along with the photograph of her grandparents alludes to the personal connection Yuki has to Japan. Munro also says, "The house, meaning the house that the works were displayed in, remains privately owned, but for the most part is not lived in. Yet where the building fabric ends and the fabric of Kihara's kimonos begins, elevated upright like dominoes on tatami, there appears the shadow of encroaching development and the socio-economic changes that befall local families. Kihara's work depicts Samoa enduring a constant state of forced change, some positive and some disastrous, while the machia, or the house, demonstrates how technology over time has changed the hand dyeing process, leaving the building with the oddity of disused dyeing vats, paper-lined smokestacks, and a small telephone booth at the heart of the Oka house. So he's essentially saying that the house itself is representative of the kind of building that would exist without socioeconomic change and gentrification and modernism. And so Kihara's work, which are depicting these changes in Samoa, contrast starkly with this traditional house, yet the house itself and the business that used to grow from it has suffered because of the industrialization of fabric dyeing processes. I'll put a link to that Munro article in the description of this episode as well. So Yuki and Aiko are definitely not the only Japanese artists practicing in Aotearoa, but I felt like Yuki was an interesting person to focus on for this series because of what they're doing at this moment and because she represented Aotearoa at the Biennale this year. So thank you very much for hanging out with me this season and listening to these different aspects of Japanese culture around Aotearoa, and a big thank you to the New Zealand Japanese Exchange Program for giving me a grant to be able to make this series. So this is it. Bye.